Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. Last night, Taylor Swift's father stood up at a table with 19 people at it and did not smile. And he looked at my son and he said, "You took 2 years." For about 90 seconds after that, nobody in that room breathed. I have been married for 46 years, and I have sat at a great many tables, and I have never seen a man do what Scott Swift did last night. He went through them. He had a list, and he went through it. The bracelet, the podcast, September 2023. And he did not laugh once, and he did not let anybody else laugh either. And my son sat in a chair, with his mouth slightly open, and said nothing at all. And Taylor did not look up. That is the thing I want to get to, and it is the reason I could not sleep. From the first sentence to the last one, 6.5 minutes, including all the laughing, and there was a great deal of laughing eventually, my daughter-in-law did not lift her head off that table once. She smiled. She laughed at the right parts. She was not frozen. She just did not look up. And I found out afterward, on a terrace, from her own father, that she has been doing it since she was about 15 years old, and that he does not know why either. He said one thing about it that I have not been able to put down. He said, "She looks up when it's about somebody else." So he made the speech about Travis. That is what this is. But there are 2 more things in it, and I want to tell you they are coming so you stay for them. The first is what my son found out this evening on the telephone about the only living thing Scott Swift told during those 13 days last August when his daughter was engaged and he was not allowed to tell anybody. It is not a person. The second is the man who stood up after him, which nobody expected, and which was my husband, and which made Taylor Swift lift her head off that table for the first time in 8 minutes and say 2 words out loud that about 2 people in that room understood. It was the 26th of August. 1 year, to the day, since they told the world. He asked her on the 13th, in a garden, 4 minutes after a podcast finished. But the 26th is the day everybody found out, and the 26th is the day they have kept. They had already done the private one. That was the 13th, and it involved a gap in a camp schedule and an ocean, and I have told it elsewhere. Last night was the family one. 19 people in a house. Both families, 4 children under 7. And at about 9 o'clock after the food, Scott Swift stood up. Part 0.5. Before, I want to give you the 2 hours before it, because they matter for what the 90 seconds did. It was a good evening. The house was somewhere I am not going to describe. 19 people, both families, which is a sentence I could not have written 2 years ago. 4 children under 7, which changes the physics of any room. Wyatt was in charge of something. Bennett had located an object. Finley, who is 17 months, spent about 40 minutes taking things out of a low cupboard and putting them on the floor in a line, which is her entire personality at the moment, and which I find magnificent. Andrea and I had been in a kitchen for about half an hour before anybody ate. I want to say something about that, because it is one of the better things that has happened to me this year. 2 years ago, Andrea Swift and I were 2 women being extremely polite to each other. Last night, we were 2 women in a kitchen, arguing about whether something needed more salt. She was right, and I did not concede. Ed and Scott were somewhere doing whatever Ed and Scott do, which, as far as I can establish, involves standing near each other and occasionally saying a sentence. They have developed a friendship that I do not entirely understand, and that appears to consist almost entirely of silence and one shared opinion about a thing on a television. Jason had brought something. Jason always brings something. He brought 2 things, and one of them was wrong, and Kylie told him it was wrong in the car, and he brought it anyway. Austin Swift arrived late and made a joke about it before he was through the door. Travis was in a very good mood. I want to note that specifically, because of what happened at 9 o'clock. He was in the mood he gets in when everybody he likes is in one place. He was loud. He was doing the thing where he moves around a room talking to everybody in it. At one point, he had Finley on one arm and was arguing with Austin about something and eating with the other hand. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea anything was coming. And Taylor. I want to describe her from the 2 hours before, because it is a different woman from the one at the table at 9 o'clock. She was in the kitchen with Andrea and me for a while. She was on the floor at one point with Finley and the cupboard. She spent about 20 minutes with Wyatt on something involving a piece of paper that was extremely serious and which I was not permitted to see. She was, in a word I have not used about her before, relaxed. I said something to Andrea about it in the kitchen. I said, "She's very easy tonight." And Andrea Swift said, "It's the house." I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Nobody's working. Look around. There is not one person in this house tonight who has a job to do." She said, "That happens about 4 times a year." I thought about that for a moment, and then I said, "Is that all it takes?" And Andrea said, "For her, yes." She said, 19 people, nobody working, no cameras, and 4 children under 7, making it impossible for anybody to be self-conscious. Then she said, "That's the whole recipe. It has been the whole recipe since she was about 19. So that is the room. Warm, loud, 4 children, 2 mothers arguing about salt, 2 fathers standing near each other in silence, a very large man from Ohio carrying a baby and eating at the same time. And at about 9 o'clock, a man who has never spoken at a table in his life stood up with a glass in his hand. Part 0 3/4, the private one. I said they had already done the private one and I skipped over it and I want to go back, because it is the thing last night was built on top of. The 13th of August was the actual anniversary of the proposal. He asked her on the 13th of August, 2025, in a garden behind his house in Leawood, Kansas, about 4 minutes after a podcast finished recording. So the 13th is theirs, and the 26th is everybody's. On the 13th of August this year, Travis was at training camp in St. Joseph, Missouri, in the last week of the 14th camp of his career. There was a gap in the schedule, no practice on the 14th, and he found it, and he got on a plane, and I have told that whole story elsewhere. 14 hours on the other side of an ocean and 18 in the air. What I did not say in that video, because I did not know it at the time, is what the 14 hours were for. It was the anniversary. I found out on Sunday. I said something to him about the trip, and he said, casually, in the middle of something else, "Yeah, well, it was the 13th. And I said, "What?" And he said, "Mom, the 13th. And I said, "Oh." I said, "You flew 4,000 miles for the anniversary of the proposal?" And Travis Kelce said, "No, I flew 4,000 miles because I wanted to see my wife." Then he said, "It being the 13th is why I looked at the schedule." I want to point at something. That man looked at a camp schedule in the last week of the most physically demanding month of his year, at 36 years old, and found a 40-hour gap. He did not find it by accident. He went looking for it because of a date. I asked her about it this afternoon, on the phone, after all of last night. I said, "Did you know he was coming for the anniversary?" And Taylor Swift said, "I didn't know he was coming at all." And I said, "I know. But afterward, did you work out what the date was?" And she said, "Not until the next day." She said, "He was there 14 hours and he never mentioned it. Not once." She said, "He left at 8 in the evening and I went to bed and woke up on the 15th and thought, hang on." I said, "And?" And she said, "And I sat up in bed and did the arithmetic and then I said something out loud in an empty room." I said, "What did you say?" And Taylor Swift said, "I'm not telling you that either." She said, "But I'll tell you what I did." She said, "I got up and I found the thing he'd brought, and I put it somewhere permanent. I know what the thing was, and I have talked about it elsewhere, and I am not going to do it again, except to say that it was in a jar, and it came off a football field in Missouri in the dark." She said, "And then I sat on the floor and thought about the fact that a man had crossed an ocean for a date he did not mention. Then she said, 'That was the anniversary, Donna.' She said, 'Not last night. Last night was the family one, and it was wonderful, and I loved every second of it.'" She said, "The anniversary was a man not mentioning something for 14 hours. Part 1. Who he is. I want to say something about Scott Swift before I tell you what he did, because I do not think people outside this have any idea, and I did not either until about 2 years ago. He does not do this. He was in finance for his whole working life. He is a man who has spent 30 years in rooms where the correct behavior is to be measured, and it took. He is warm. He is genuinely, uncomplicatedly warm. He is the one who talks to everybody at a thing, who remembers what your cousin does, who asks about a knee you mentioned in February. But he is not a performer. He has never once, in the 3 years I have known that family, stood up in a room and spoken. Andrea speaks. Andrea is extremely good at it. Austin will speak if you make him. Scott does not. So when he stood up at about 9 o'clock last night with a glass in his hand, the room reorganized itself in about a second and a half. I looked at Andrea, and Andrea was already looking at him. I want to be clear about that, because I asked her about it afterward, and she told me the truth, which is that she did not know he was going to do it either. Part 2, the first sentence. He said, "I'd like to say something about Travis." Which is normal. That is a completely normal thing to say at a table. And then he did not smile. I want to describe what that did, because a great deal of what happened over the next 90 seconds was carried entirely by his face. Scott Swift smiles. That is his baseline condition. It is not performance and it is not politeness. The man is simply pleased most of the time, and it shows. He put the glass down, and he did not smile. And he said, "I've been quiet about some things for 2 years, and I'd like to say them now." I felt the table go. Not a noise. There was no noise. 19 people made no sound at all, and something in the room dropped about 4 degrees. Kylie told me afterward that she put her hand on Jason's leg under the table. Jason told me afterward that he did not notice, which tells you where his attention was. Part 3. What he said. I am going to give you this as closely as I can. I have gone over it with 3 people who were there, and we agree on the substance and mostly on the wording. He looked at Travis, and he said, "You took 2 years." Travis said, "Sorry?" And Scott Swift said, "From the first time you met her to the day you asked her, 2 years." And Travis said something like, "I don't," and did a small laugh, the kind you do when you cannot tell yet what is happening. And Scott did not laugh with him. He said, "I'd like to go through them." Part 4, the list. He went through them. I want you to understand that this took about a minute, and that during it not one person at that table moved. He said, July 2023. You went to a concert. You made a bracelet with your phone number on it. You did not give it to her. He said, you had it in your hand for 3 hours, and you did not give it to her. He said, then you went on a podcast and complained about it to the entire country. He said, my daughter found out you existed because you complained about her on the radio. There was a noise from somewhere near Austin, not a laugh, something involuntary. He said, September 2023. She came to a game. Do you know what she said to me on the phone the night before? And Travis said, no. And Scott Swift said, neither do I. I'm asking you. That got a small laugh from about 4 people, and he did not acknowledge it, and it died immediately. He said, 2024. London. You went on a stage in a top hat. He said, I watched it on a screen with my wife, and I said one sentence to her, and I'm going to say it in this room. He said, I said, that man is going to embarrass himself for her in front of 90,000 people, and he does not care. He let that sit. And then he said, which was the first time I thought you might be all right. Part 5. The part that took the air out. And then he stopped doing the list. And he looked at my son, and he said something that I have not been able to stop hearing since about 9:15 last night. He said, I want to talk about the 26th of August. He said, a year ago tonight. He said, you asked her on the 13th. Everybody in this room knows that. He said, and you waited 13 days to tell the world. And he said, do you know what I did on those 13 days? Travis said, no. And Scott Swift said, I sat in a house in Nashville and did nothing. He said, because my daughter had told me on the 14th, and she asked me not to say anything to anybody, and I did not say anything to anybody. He said, not to my son, not to my brother, not to a friend I have had since 1974. He said, 13 days. And then he said, and every single one of those days I thought about what would happen to her if it went wrong. I want to describe what the room was at that moment. There was a child somewhere in the house making a noise, and it was the only sound. Ed had his hand flat on the tablecloth. Jason was looking at his plate. Andrea Swift was looking directly at her husband with an expression I could not read. And Taylor was looking at the table. She had not looked up since the word 2 years. Part 6, 90 seconds in. Scott said, I have watched a great many people be interested in my daughter for 20 years. He said, some of them were fine, some of them were not. Most of them were somewhere in between, and all of them, every single one, wanted something. And he said, and I want to say what I thought about you in September of 2023. He said it slowly. He said, I thought. Here is another one. Nobody moved. He said, I thought my daughter is 33 years old, and she has been through a great deal, and here is a very large man from Ohio who plays a sport and complains about her on the radio. He said, and I thought, this will take about 11 months, and then I will be the one on the telephone at 2 in the morning. And then Scott Swift said, I was wrong about that. He said, I want that on the record in this room, in front of both families. He said, I was completely wrong, and I have been wrong for 2 years, and I have never said so out loud. Part 7, The Turn. And then he picked the glass back up, and he said, also, you are the worst driver I have ever been in a car with. The room came apart. I want to try to describe it, and I am going to fail. 19 people had been holding their breath for approximately 90 seconds, and a man in his 70s said something about parallel parking, and the entire table detonated. Jason made a noise I have not heard him make since about 2009. Austin Swift put his head on the table. Kylie was crying with laughter inside about 4 seconds. Ed, my husband, who does not laugh out loud, laughed out loud. And Travis Kelce sat there with his mouth open going, what? Which made it worse. Scott said, over the noise, I have been in a car with that man 4 times, and I have prayed on 3 of them. And Travis said, I'm a good driver. And Scott Swift said, you are not. Part 8. The rest of it. He kept going for about 4 more minutes, and it was one of the funniest things I have ever heard. He had a list. He had an actual list. He had been keeping it. He said, you call my daughter Tay in front of me, and I have decided to allow it. He said, You have eaten in my house 11 times, and you have never once known what you were eating. He said, At Christmas, you asked my wife where she got the potatoes. Andrea said, From the table. He asked me where I got the potatoes. And Scott said, He asked her where she got the potatoes. Travis, they were potatoes. He said, And in July you married her. And he stopped again. But it was different this time. The room had learned by then. Nobody went cold. 19 people were still catching their breath from the potatoes, and they simply came down with him. Part 9. The end of it. He said, I'd like to say the actual thing now, and then I'll sit down. He said, On the 26th of August last year, my daughter put something on the internet, and about 400 million people found out at once. He said, and I was in Nashville, and my wife was next to me, and we watched a number go up on a screen. He said, and I thought about 2006. He said, She was 16, and we drove her somewhere, and there were about 40 people there. He said, 40, in a room, and she came off and asked me if I thought it went well. He said, and I said yes. And he said, and I was lying, because I had no idea. I did not know anything about any of it. I was a man from Pennsylvania who worked in finance, and I had no idea whether it had gone well, and I said yes. He said, and last August I watched a number go up on a screen, and I thought about a 16-year-old asking me if I thought 40 people had enjoyed it. And then he looked at Travis. And Scott Swift said, And the reason I'm all right about all of it is that I know she asks you now. He said, She does not ask me anymore. She has not asked me in about 12 years, and that is exactly how it should be. He said, She asks you. He said, and I have watched you answer her honestly about 4 times when it would have been considerably easier to be nice. He said, Which is the whole job. That is the entire job, and almost nobody does it. And then he said, to Travis, and he sat down. Part 9.5. Then Ed stood up. Nobody expected that either. Scott had been down for about 90 seconds. The room was still coming off it. Somebody had started talking again. Jason was saying something to Austin about the driving thing, and my husband put his hands on the table and stood up. I want you to understand what this is. Ed Kelce has spoken at 4 things in his life, and 2 of them were his son's weddings. He does not do this. He has never done this. He was in a room where a man had just done a 6.5-minute set piece, and he stood up anyway. I did not know what he was going to say, and I have been married to him for 46 years. He said, I'll be quick, which got a laugh, because everybody in that room knows he will be. He said, Scott's done the speech. I'm not doing a speech. He said, I want to say one thing to my son, and then I'm sitting down. And he looked at Travis, and he said, You did it the right way round. Travis said, What? And my husband said, You got the family first. He said, Most people fall in love, and then they meet the family, and they put up with them. He said, You spent 2 years in these people's houses before you asked her anything. He said, You know her father's opinions. You've been in her mother's kitchen. You know what her brother does for a living, which is more than most brothers-in-law manage. He said, And she's been in mine. And then Ed Kelce said, She was in my garage. I want to explain, because about 11 people in that room did not know what he meant, and I did. There is a box in my garage in Cleveland. It has been there since 1989. It has 2 whistles in it, and 2 clipboards, and a rock from a practice field, and my husband put it there when his coaching career ended, and it has not been opened since about 1994. I found out about it this summer. I have told that story. He said, Last Christmas she asked me what was in the garage. He said, and I said nothing, because that is what I say. He said, And she said, "Ed, there's a box." I did not know this. I want to be clear. I have been married to that man since 1980, and I found out at a table last night, at the same time as 17 other people, that Taylor Swift went into my garage last Christmas. He said, so I showed her. And he said, and she picked it up, and she turned it over once, and she put it back, and she said one thing. He said, she said, that's the right size. And Ed said, and I did not ask what she meant. He said, and she did not explain. He said, and that was the entire conversation, and it was in December, and I have thought about it about once a week since. He said, so, to Travis, you did it the right way round. And he sat down. I want to tell you what happened at that table. Taylor Swift looked up. For the first time in about 8 minutes. She looked up, and she looked at my husband, and she said, out loud, across a table, in front of 19 people, which she does not do. She said, "The Ed." And he said, And she said, it was the right size. And Ed Kelce, who has said perhaps 4 sentimental sentences per decade since 1953, said, I know it was. Nobody else at that table had any idea what was happening, and I want you to know that I did, and that I put my napkin over my face. Part 10. She still hadn't looked up. She had not looked up. From, you took 2 years, to, and he sat down, which was, by my count, about 6.5 minutes, including all the laughing. Taylor Swift did not look up from the table once. I was almost directly across from her. I want to describe what I could see, because I have been thinking about it for a day. She was smiling for the funny parts. That was real. You could see it happening. She was not sitting there frozen. She laughed at the potatoes. She just did not lift her head. And when he sat down, there were about 4 seconds where nobody knew what happened next. And then she got up and went round the table. 19 people watched a woman walk the length of a table and put her arms around her father from behind while he was sitting in a chair. And she said something to him that nobody heard. I asked her about it today, on the telephone. I said, what did you say to him? And Taylor Swift said, I'm not telling you. I said, was it about the speech? And she said, no. And I said, what was it about? And she said, 2006. Part 11. What he told me afterward. I got about 11 minutes with Scott last night, later on, out on a terrace, because I wanted to know one thing, and I asked him directly. I said, did you plan the first half? And he said, which half? And I said, the cold half. And Scott Swift said, yes. I said, why? And he said, because if I'd started with the driving, they'd have laughed for 8 minutes, and I'd have sat down, and it would have been a nice evening. He said, I have been sitting on the thing about September 2023 for 2 years. He said, I was wrong about that man, and I have never said so, and there is not a good moment to say it, and I am 73 years old. He said, so I decided to make a moment. I said, you frightened everybody. And Scott said, I know. And I said, your daughter did not look up for 6 minutes. And he was quiet for a second. And then he said, she never looks up. I said, what? And Scott Swift said, when it's about her, she looks at the table. He said, she has done it since she was about 15. Every award. Every time anybody says anything about her in a room. He said, everybody thinks it's modesty. I said, what is it? And he said, I have no idea. 36 years and I do not know. Then he said, but she looks up when it's about somebody else. He said, that is why the speech was about Travis. Part 12. What Andrea said. I called Andrea today. I said, did you know? And Andrea Swift said, I knew he'd been writing something. I did not know what was in it, and he did not tell me. I said, "How did you feel during the first bit?" And she said, "Donna, I nearly kicked him." She said, "I could not reach him. That is the only reason I did not do it. He was standing up and I was sitting down, and there was a table leg in the way." She said, "About 40 seconds in, I thought, what are you doing?" I said, "And then?" And Andrea said, "And then he said the thing about the 13 days." She said, "And I understood." I said, "Understood what?" And Andrea Swift said that he was not doing it for Travis. She said, "Those 13 days in August of last year were the worst 13 days that man has had since about 2009. She said, "He did not sleep. He walked around the house at night. He would not say what it was, and I knew exactly what it was." She said, "Our daughter told us on the 14th of August and asked us not to say anything to anybody, and Scott sat in a house for 13 days, knowing that she was engaged, and that in 2 weeks the entire world was going to have an opinion about it." She said, "He was not saying I was wrong about you to Travis." She said, "He was saying it out loud so he could stop carrying it." Part 13. What Travis said today. He called me at about 11 this morning. He said, "Did you see Scott last night?" And I said, "I was 3 feet away, Travis." And he said, "No, I mean, did you see him?" I said, "What do you mean?" And my son said, "Mom, that man took me apart." He said, "I have been in locker rooms since I was 14 years old, and I have never been taken apart like that." I said, "You laughed." And he said, "I laughed after." He said, "For the first minute, I genuinely thought, I thought I'd done something." I said, "What did you think you'd done?" And Travis said, "I didn't know. That's the whole thing." I sat there going through everything I've done since 2023. He said, and then he said the thing about the 13 days. And he stopped. He said, "I didn't know that." I said, "About the waiting?" And my son said, "I knew we waited 13 days. Obviously I knew. I was there, it was my idea to wait." He said, "I did not know what those 13 days were for him." He said, "I have never once thought about it. Not once. In a year." He said, "I thought about what it was for us, and I thought about the announcement, and I did not think about a man in a house in Nashville, not sleeping for 2 weeks." I said, "Are you all right?" And Travis Kelce said, "Yeah." Then he said, "I'm going to call him." And I said, "What are you going to say?" And my son said, "I don't know, something stupid." He said, he made a joke about my driving because he could not say the other thing without it. He said, "So I'll probably make a joke about the potatoes." Part 13 and a half. What else happened? The evening did not end when Scott sat down. It went on for another 3 hours, and I want to give you some of it, because it was one of the better nights of my life, and I do not want it remembered as 90 cold seconds. Jason spoke. Of course Jason spoke. Nobody asked him to. He stood up about 20 minutes after Ed and said, "Right, everybody's doing it now." And he did 4 minutes that were purely, relentlessly funny, and contained not one sincere sentence, which after Scott and Ed was exactly the correct instrument. He did a bit about the podcast. He did a bit about his own wedding speech from July that involved him telling the room he had peaked. He did a thing about Austin that made Austin put his head down on the table for the second time in one evening. And he sat down without saying one true thing, deliberately, because he had read the room. I said to him afterward, "You didn't do the sincere bit." And Jason Kelce said, "2 other men did the sincere bit, Mom. Somebody's got to hold the other end." Kylie did not speak. And I want to note that, because Kylie standing up at a table is a rare and frightening event, and everybody at that table was slightly braced for it after the rehearsal dinner in July. She did not. She sat there. Afterward I said, "You were quiet." And she said, "I said mine in July." Austin Swift made a toast that lasted 11 seconds and consisted entirely of him raising a glass and saying, "Yeah, all right," and sitting down, and it got the second biggest laugh of the night after the driving. Andrea did not speak either. I asked her about it today, and she said, "I'd have cried." And I said, "So?" And Andrea Swift said, "Donna, if I cry, she cries, and then it is a different evening." She said, "I have been managing that particular mechanism since about 2008, and I know exactly what it costs." And the children. I want to end this section on the children because it is the thing I will actually remember. At about 10 o'clock, well after all of it, Wyatt came and stood next to Scott Swift's chair. She is 6. She has met him perhaps 15 times. She calls him Mr. Scott, which nobody taught her and which he has never corrected. And she said, "Mr. Scott," and he said, "Yes." And Wyatt Kelce said, "Are you still cross with Uncle Trav?" The people who heard it stopped, and Scott Swift put down his glass and turned in his chair and gave a 6-year-old his complete attention, which I noticed and have thought about since. And he said, "I was never cross with him." And Wyatt said, "You sounded cross." And he said, "I know, that was on purpose." And she thought about that for a second, and she said, "Why?" And Scott Swift said, "Because I had a nice thing to say, and if I'd said it in a nice voice, nobody would have listened." And Wyatt said, "Oh." And then she said, "That's clever," and walked off. He looked at me across the table, and I said, "She's 6. And Scott Swift said, "She's terrifying." Part 13 3/4, the 13 days. He said it in the speech, and then he moved on, and I let him move on, and then I could not sleep on Wednesday night thinking about it. 13 days. The 14th of August to the 26th of August, 2025. He knew his daughter was engaged, and he could not tell one person on this earth. I called Andrea on Thursday morning, and I said, "I want the 13 days." And Andrea Swift said, "I wondered if you'd ask." Day 1. The 14th of August, 2025. Taylor called them in the morning. Andrea said, she called at about 9, and she said, "Are you both there?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Put me on speaker." She said, and then she said it. And I said, "What did Scott do?" And Andrea Swift said, "He stood up." She said, "He was sitting at a table, and he stood up. He did not say anything. He just stood up and stayed standing for about 10 seconds. She said, and then he said, "When?" And Taylor said, "Last night." And he said, "Where?" And she said, "The garden." And he said, "Okay." She said, and then she said the thing about not telling anybody. She said, "We're not saying anything for a couple of weeks, so please don't say anything to anybody." And Scott said, "Of course." She said, and then we hung up and I looked at him, and he was still standing. Days 2 through 5. Andrea said these were fine. She said, he was happy. He was genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy for about 4 days. He kept saying it out loud in the house, to me, at random intervals. He'd be doing something, and he'd say, "She's getting married." She said, about 9 times a day. Day 6. The 19th. Andrea said, "This is where it turned, and I know exactly when." She said, his brother called about something completely unrelated, some family thing, a 20-minute phone call about nothing, and Scott said nothing. She said, he came off the phone and sat down and did not say anything for about half an hour. And I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I just talked to my brother for 20 minutes. She said, and I understood immediately. And I said, "You can't tell him." And Scott Swift said, "I know I can't." Then he said, "I've never not told him anything." Andrea told me they have been close their entire lives. She said Scott has told that man everything since about 1962. She said, and my daughter asked him for 13 days, and he gave her 13 days, and he did not tell his brother, and he has never mentioned it to him since. I said, "His brother still doesn't know?" And Andrea Swift said, "His brother thinks he found out on the 26th, like everybody else." Days 7 through 10. This is where the not sleeping started. She said, he'd be up at 2, 3 in the morning, walking around the house, not doing anything, not reading, not on a phone, walking. She said, and I let it go for 2 nights, and on the 3rd night, I got up and went and found him in the kitchen at about 10 past 3. And she said, "What is it?" And Scott said, "Nothing." And Andrea said, "Scott." And she said he stood in a kitchen in Nashville at 10 past 3 in the morning and said one sentence. He said, "They're going to have an opinion." She said, and I said, "About what?" And her husband said, "About her. In about a week, the entire world is going to have an opinion about the most private thing that has ever happened to my daughter, and there is not one thing I can do about it." Andrea told me she did not have an answer for that, and she said so. She said, I said, "No, there isn't." And he said, "I know." And then they stood in a kitchen together at 3 in the morning for a while and went back to bed. Day 11. The 24th. Andrea said, "This is the one that got her." She said, "He cleaned the house." I said, "What?" And she said, "He cleaned the entire house, top to bottom. He started at about 7 in the morning, and he did not stop until about 4 in the afternoon." She said, "Rooms nobody goes in. He did the garage." I said, "Why?" And Andrea Swift said, "Because he could not do anything else." She said, "A man had 11 days of something enormous sitting in him, and no way to put it anywhere, and no person to give it to." She said, "So he cleaned a house." She said, and at about 4 he came into the kitchen and sat down, and I said, "Are you finished?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you feel better?" And Scott Swift said, "No." Day 13. The 26th. Andrea said Taylor called them in the morning. She said, "It's going up this afternoon." And Scott said, "Okay." And Taylor said, "Dad?" And he said, "I'm all right," Andrea said. And she said, 13 days is a long time." And Scott said, "It was fine." And Taylor said, "Mom told me about the house." I stopped her there. I said, "Andrea, you told her?" And Andrea Swift said, "I told her on the 25th. I called her without telling him, and I said, 'Your father cleaned the entire house yesterday.' I said, 'Why did you tell her?' And she said, because she was about to spend the rest of her life with a man who does not tell people things, and I thought she should know what it looks like from the outside when somebody carries something for you." She said, and I wanted her to see it in her father first, where it is safe, before she had to see it in a husband. I sat in my kitchen with the telephone, and I said, "Andrea." And she said, "What?" And I said, "That's the smartest thing anybody in this story has done." She said, "It was not smart." It was about 4 seconds of instinct on a Monday. Then she said, and it worked, apparently, because a year later that girl went round a table and put her arms around him. Part 13 and 7/8. What she said to him. I asked her again this afternoon. I said, "I know you're not going to tell me, but I'm going to ask one more time." And Taylor Swift said, "You're persistent." And I said, I'm 73. She said, I'll give you one word. And I said, go on. And she said, house. I said, the house? And she said, that's your word, Donna. That's all you're getting. She said, my mother told me on the 25th of August last year that my father had cleaned an entire house because he had nowhere to put something. She said, and last night he stood up at a table and did the same thing in front of 19 people. And this time everybody watched him do it. She said, I said something about the house. Then she said, and he knew exactly what I meant and nobody else did. And that is the entire arrangement I have had with that man since I was about 6 years old. Part 14. What I think he did. I have had a day, and I want to say what I think happened in that room, because I have watched a great many speeches, and I have never seen anybody do this. He used 90 seconds of genuine fear to buy 400 milliseconds. Here is the mechanism. If Scott Swift had stood up and said, warmly, I want to say that I was wrong about Travis, it would have been lovely, and everybody would have said, aw, and it would have lasted about 6 seconds and been forgotten by dessert. Instead, he made 19 people believe, for a minute and a half, that something was actually wrong. And in that state, with the room cold and everybody braced, he said, I was wrong about you, into total silence. And it landed like a hammer. And then, before anybody could sit with the discomfort of it, he said something about parallel parking and released the entire room in about 1 second. That is not a speech. That is engineering. I said that to him on the terrace. I said, that was engineered. And Scott Swift said, I was in finance for 30 years, Donna. He said, it's all engineered. Everything anybody says in a room is engineered. Then he said, most people just engineer it badly. Part 15. The thing I noticed. There is one more thing, and I have not told anybody, and I am going to put it here. When he did the cold section, the 2 years, the list, September 2023, my son did not defend himself. Not once. He said sorry at the beginning, and I'm a good driver at the end, and in between he said nothing at all. He sat in a chair while a man in his 70s listed his failures in front of 19 people, including his own mother and both his brother's family and his wife, and he did not say one word. I asked him about it today. I said, why didn't you say anything? And Travis said, because he's her dad. I said, that's it? And my son said, Mom, he's her dad. He can say whatever he wants to me for the rest of my life. He said, I married her. That's the deal. That was always the deal. He said, and also I was fairly sure I'd done something, and I was waiting to find out what. Part 15 and a half, the garage. I called her this afternoon, and I asked her about the box. I said, you went in my garage. And Taylor Swift said, I did, and I've been waiting 8 months for somebody to bring it up. I said, what did you mean, the right size? And there was a pause. And she said, do you actually want the answer, or do you want the nice version? And I said, the actual one. She said, it's a rock, Donna. She said, a man had a 30-year thing end, and he took a rock. She said, I have watched an enormous number of people mark the end of things. She said, I have been to the retirements, and the last shows, and the farewell whatever they are, and there is always a gesture, and the gesture is almost always enormous, and it is almost always for other people. She said, and I stood in a garage in Cleveland at Christmas, and a man showed me a cardboard box with a rock in it that he has never mentioned to anybody in 37 years. She said, and I thought, that's the right size. She said, not too big, not for anybody. Nobody applauded. It cost nothing, and it is the whole thing. Then she said, and I was thinking about Travis. I said, last Christmas? And Taylor said, Obviously last Christmas. She said. He was in the middle of the worst season of his career, and everybody was asking whether it was the last one, and I did not know what the end was going to look like for him. She said. And I was frightened it would be enormous. She said. I was frightened it would be a whole thing, on a field, with a tribute, and cameras, and that afterward he would be standing in a hallway somewhere, with nothing. She said. And then I saw a box in a garage. She said. And I thought, all right, there's another way to do this. Then she said. He's going to take something off a field. I said. He did. And Taylor Swift said, I know he did. She said, he brought it to London in a jar and gave it to me and said, this is where I've been. She said, and he has never heard of that box, Donna. She said, he doesn't know it exists. You told me it took you until this summer, and you've lived in that house since 1980. She said, two men in the same family took a handful of a place they were leaving, and neither of them knows the other one did it. And then she said, the thing that I have been sitting with since about 4 o'clock this afternoon. She said, that's what I meant last night. I said, about what? And Taylor said, when your husband said I'd been in the garage. She said, he thought he was saying something nice about me. She said, he was actually telling 19 people the most important thing anybody said all night, and about 2 of us understood it. I said, what was it? And Taylor Swift said, that it runs in them. She said, whatever it is, the rock, the jar, the not telling anybody. She said, I married into a family of men who take a piece of a thing and put it in a box and never mention it, and I did not know that in 2023, and I know it now, and it is the single most useful thing I have ever learned about my husband. Then she said, and I found it out in a garage in Cleveland at Christmas from a man who says 4 sentences a decade. Part 15 3/4. He called him. He said he was going to, and he did. He called me back at about 6 this evening and said, I called Scott. And I said, and? And Travis Kelce said, it went about how you'd expect. He said, he picked up and I said, hey. And he said, hello, Travis. And there were about 4 seconds where neither of us said anything. He said, and then I did the potatoes. I said, you did the potatoes? And he said, I said, I've been thinking about the potatoes, and I want to say that I stand by the question. He said, and there was a pause, and then that man laughed for about 11 seconds. He said, I have never heard him laugh like that. I've known him 3 years, and I have never heard it. He said, and then it went quiet again. And he said, and I said the thing. I said, what thing? And my son said, I said, I didn't know about the 13 days. He said, and Scott said, it doesn't matter. And Travis said, it matters to me. And Scott said, Travis, it was a year ago. And he said, and I said, Mom, I don't know where this came from. I did not plan it. He said, I said, who did you tell? I said, what? And my son said, I asked him who he told, in the 13 days. I said, there must have been somebody. And he said there was a very long silence on that telephone. And then Scott Swift said, nobody. And Travis said, not your brother? And Scott said, no. He said, and I said, not anybody? And there was another silence. And then Taylor's father said, I told a dog. I put my hand over my mouth in my own kitchen. Travis said, I said, you told a dog? And Scott said, there's a dog on the street. I walk past it. I told the dog. He said, and I said, what did you say to the dog? And Scott Swift said, I said my daughter's getting married. And my son said, and then neither of us could talk for a bit. He said, and then he said, don't tell Andrea about the dog. And I said, why not? And he said, because she'll be upset that I told a dog and not her. And I did tell her, obviously. She was the only person I could tell, but she was in it with me, so it wasn't the same, Travis said. And I said, so you needed somebody who wasn't in it. And Scott said, yes. And Travis said, and you picked a dog. And Scott Swift said, it was a very good dog. I sat in my kitchen in Cleveland this evening and laughed until I had to put the phone down on the table. And then my son said one more thing. He said, Mom, I said something to him at the end, and I want to tell you because I don't think I'll say it again. I said, what did you say? And he said, I said, I'm going to be the one you can tell. I did not say anything. He said, I said, if there's another 13 days, for anything, ever, you can tell me. I'm in it and I'm not her. That's a useful thing to be. I said, what did he say? And Travis Kelce said, nothing for about 5 seconds. And then he said, all right. And my son said, and then he said, you're still a terrible driver. And I said, I know. And he said, good. And we hung up. Part 16. For the people listening, I want to say one thing to the women my age, and it is short. There is somebody you were wrong about. A son-in-law, a daughter-in-law, a boyfriend from 1994 that you were unpleasant about at the time. You have known you were wrong for years, and you have never said it, because there is no moment for it, because saying it out loud would be strange and enormous, and the other person would not know what to do with their face. Scott Swift is 73 years old, and he sat on it for 2 years, and then made a moment. He did not wait for one. There was never going to be one. He stood up at a family dinner and frightened 19 people for 90 seconds so that 6 words would land properly. You do not have to frighten anybody. But you do have to say it out loud, in a room, to their face, where they cannot pretend not to have heard. Otherwise it stays yours forever, and they never get it. And there is a second thing, and it is smaller, and I think it might be more useful. You need somebody who is not in it. That man had 13 days of something enormous, and one person he could tell, and she was in it with him, which meant she could not carry any of it, because she was already carrying her own. And so he found a dog on a street in Nashville. I am not being funny about that. I have thought about it all evening, and I have decided it is the most sensible thing in this entire story. A 72-year-old man worked out that he needed to say a sentence out loud to something that was not involved, and he found the only available option, and he used it, and it got him through 11 more days. So, find your dog. A friend 2 towns over. A woman you see at a thing on Tuesdays. Somebody who does not know anybody. Not to solve it, not to advise you. To hear it once, out loud, from somebody who has nothing at stake in it. That is a real need, and almost nobody arranges for it, and most people my age have quietly stopped having anybody like that at all. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. Last night, a man from Pennsylvania who has never spoken at a table in his life stood up and told my son he had been wrong about him for 2 years, in front of both families, in a room that had stopped breathing. And then he said something about parallel parking, and 19 people came apart. And his daughter, who did not lift her head once in 6.5 minutes, got up and walked round a table and put her arms around him from behind and said something about 2006 that nobody heard and nobody is ever going to. And earlier in that same evening, my husband, who has said 4 sentimental sentences per decade since 1953, stood up and told 19 people that my daughter-in-law went into our garage last Christmas. He thought he was saying something nice. He was actually saying the most important thing anybody said all night, and about 2 of us understood it, and one of them was the woman who has not looked up from a table since she was 15 years old. She looked up for that. And this evening my son called Taylor's father and asked him who he had told during those 13 days last August, and the answer was a dog on a street in Nashville. And then Travis said, "I'm going to be the one you can tell." And Scott Swift said nothing for 5 seconds, and then said, "All right." And then he said, "You're still a terrible driver." 18 days until Denver. Thank you for sitting with me today.